There is a story that is told of a box. This box lived on the top shelf of a closet for all but one day of the year. To anyone who might see it nestled among hat boxes, winter scarves, and shopping bags, it might just look like a box like any other. But this was no ordinary box. This box was special. This box was holy. Each year on Erev Yom Kippur, Marty would take down this box and bring it with him to the synagogue. Before he took his seat in the center of the 10th row of the sanctuary, right side, Marty would carry the box into the small back room off the social hall and place it on a small table set with a blue velvet cloth. Marty would close the door to the room, walk back through and then out of the social hall, put on his talit, and take his seat for the Kol Nidre service. But what of the box? All evening, as the prayers were being chanted in the sanctuary, the box would sit and wait for its big moment. As everyone went home after the service and the shamus turned off the lights, the box listened as the lock clicked into place and the building all around it fell into a deep silence in the wee hours of the holiest day of the year. And the box tingled with anticipation when on Yom Kippur morning, the synagogue building sprang back to life as people of all ages and sizes, dressed in all white, began to pass through the doors of the sanctuary and into the service. For the box knew that its moment was nearly here. Each year on the afternoon of Yom Kippur, as the morning service drew to a close, people would one by one begin to walk through the social hall and into the back room. They would each close the door behind them, remain in the room for a minute or two, and then silently exit the room, leaving the door slightly ajar so that the next person to approach would know that it was okay to enter. Each year on the afternoon of Yom Kippur, this ritual would unfold in the small back room of this certain synagogue. And each year on Yom Kippur, Marty's daughter, Shira, would tug on her father's jacket sleeve and ask, Papa, what happens in that room? What is in that box? And each year, Marty would reply, Shirala, what happens in that room is kehillah, is community. For the box is filled with chesed, with loving kindness. Papa, that's just not possible. That small back room can't possibly be filled with kehillah. There's ever only just one person inside. And how can a box be filled with chesed? Chesed isn't something you can fit in a box. And besides, I know that that's the box from your closet. I've seen it hundreds of times. I've even taken it down and looked at it, and it's always empty. Papa, won't you tell me what really happens in that room? Won't you tell me what's really in that box? Shira pleaded. But Marty just smiled his wry smile. Shirala, he said, I promise that what I have told you is true. All afternoon, Shira watched with her eyes peeled as each adult member of the synagogue would walk into the back room one by one, close the door, and leave a few minutes later. This continued on and off as the sounds of the book of Jonah floated through the synagogue during the Mincha service, as soft voices recited names of loved ones gone from this world during Yizkor, and all the way until it was time to gather for the final long Tekiyah Gedolah of the shofar that signaled the end of Yom Kippur. As everyone filed out of the sanctuary, Shira knew what her father would do next. Each year, before he took his break the fast bagel, Marty would give Shira a kiss on the head and then walk to the small back room off the social hall and retrieve the box from the table with the blue velvet cloth. He would then take his bagel and place the box beneath his chair, ready to bring it home and return it to its closet shelf. This year, however, something different happened. Marty did not lean down to give Shira a kiss on her head, but instead, he took her by the hand. Together, Marty and Shira walked out of the sanctuary and into the small back room. Together, they walked up to the table with the box. Go ahead, Shira. Open it, Marty said. Shira opened the box and she did not know what to say. In the box, she saw coins, bills, bus tokens, Store credit certificates to the local grocer? Papa, what does this mean? She asked. Marty said nothing. He simply picked up the box and carefully emptied the remaining contents into the tzedakah box near the corner of the room. He placed the now empty box under one arm and put his other arm around his daughter. Together, they walked out of the room, fixed themselves a bagel, and ate their breakfast meal. In that moment, Shira understood. Throughout Yom Kippur afternoon, each adult in the community would take their turn to enter the back room and either put in or take out exactly what they needed from the box to sustain themselves for the year. No one ever knew who put in or took out, or how much, or whether they took the same action this year as they did the year before. And at the end of the day, anything that remained was given to tzedakah, to be distributed by the rabbi or the Sado chairs to those who were in need in the wider world. In that moment, Shira understood. Her father was telling her the truth. In that room, Kehillah, community, was happening. And the box, that little box that every other day of the year sat on a shelf in their closet, was indeed filled with chesed, with loving kindness. This story of individuals caring for each other, of a community which sees mutual aid as a value and responsibility, we wonder what would this story look like if it were scaled up to encompass a much wider audience. In the Mishnah, in Pirkei Avot, it is taught, any city that does not have in it these 10 things, it is not appropriate for a sage, in Hebrew, a Talmid Chacham, to live within it. A court that metes out punishments, a tzedakah fund collected by 2 and distributed by 3, a synagogue, a bathhouse, a restroom, a doctor, a bookkeeper, a notary for writing mezuzot and ketubot and other legal scrolls, a butcher, and a teacher of children. Each of these 10 things represents a piece of critical infrastructure that is vital to creating a just and sustainable community. This list takes into account security concerns and the need for a legal system, both to adjudicate and to produce, witness, and keep records of legal documents. It includes mechanisms to support sanitation and health care, both physical health and also social, emotional, and mental health, with the specific inclusion of the bathhouse, a place for people to gather for mental health needs. And also includes both institutions for educational and spiritual growth. And most important to our discussion today, it requires a tzedakah fund collected by 2 and distributed by 3. Why would a tzedakah fund be a part of critical infrastructure? One might argue that this is similar to a system of taxation, but the funds do not go to a governing authority or central bureaucracy, but rather, with very few stops, would just go straight into the hands of individuals in the community who need. It's resource redistribution on a small scale, but why is this necessary? Couldn't it just be a given that community takes care of each other? Shouldn't that care happen automatically? Why is it necessary to legislate that this happen, to set up a structure and mandate that people give charity? In response, I would argue that what is important to understand in this Mishnah is not the question of why it is legislated or whether it ought to be, but what the definition of tzedakah fund is and how we understand that word. Because in the Mishnah, the fund that is described is not about charity. That is very much the wrong translation. This fund, a kupat tzedakah, is about justice. Like many people, when I first learned the word tzedakah, I was taught that it meant charity. Tzedakah was the dollar bill that you brought to Hebrew school and handed to your teacher when they took attendance. Tzedakah was the coins that you dropped in a little box on Friday night, or when you emptied your pockets of change at the end of the day. Tzedakah was charity, money that people or groups, like my Hebrew school, for example, donated to those who were in need. But as my learning deepened, I discovered that tzedakah was far more than that. The word tzedakah comes from the Hebrew root tzadi dalid kuf. In the book of Deuteronomy, we read tzedek, tzedek tirdof, tzadik dalid kuf, tzedek, which means justice, justice shall you pursue. The act of doing tzedek, that is the action called tzedakah, is the commandment to do justice. It is not an optional act of the heart. This is not an act of charity. It is an imperative. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue. Given this commandment, I want to offer that we officially, here and now, stop translating tzedakah as charity, but rather something like using our resources to promote or pursue justice. Across the library of Jewish tradition, we find examples of how our ancient rabbinic and medieval ancestors understood the commandment to pursue justice and build a society with tzedakah as part of its core. We find texts that take for granted the underlying assumption that one of the central functions of a community is to serve as a social, financial, and food security net. One of the prime examples is the agricultural system of tzedakah, alluded to in Torah and fleshed out in the Mishnah and the Talmud, the system of leket, peah, and shichacha. In the book of Leviticus and again in Deuteronomy, we read the commandment for growers to leave portions of their crops, either designated for or wholly unharvested, as a portion that belongs to the poor in their midst. Leket, leaving the fallen fruit and unharvested grain. Peah, leaving the corners of your fields unharvested. And shichacha, leaving the forgotten produce where it is. The unharvested crops are then available for the taking. Our Torah stipulates that they should be left for the most vulnerable in our society, the poor, the stranger, the widow, and the orphan. And the Talmud goes even further to ensure that they are truly available to any person who needs, by clarifying that the farmer may not select the recipient of the gifts. In the Talmud, we read that they are left in the field available for any poor person who comes to gather them, rather than gifted to a particular individual. We read in the Mishnah that there are also stipulations that the categories extend to the non-Jewish poor, assuming that you are living in a community that is more diverse, a community much more like the ones we live in today. In fact, the only person, Maimonides explains, that cannot benefit from the crops of the corners of the fields is the farmer himself or herself, even if they themselves are amongst the poor of Israel. They may not eat from their own peah. They can benefit from the peah of other fields, but never their own. Why is this practice commanded? Unlike many mitzvot, our Torah provides a justification. It is our obligation to promote a just society because we have known what it was like to live within one of injustice and inequity. We are obligated because of empathy, as it says in Deuteronomy chapter 24, and you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and therefore I command you to do this thing. We are obligated to uphold the dignity of others as our dignity was not upheld. And further, we are obligated to allow them to make their decisions and determinations about their own situations and needs, and the needs of their sub-communities shaped by poverty. We learn this from the directive that the poor may take peah both on their behalf and on the behalf of a specific person who is also poor, but one who is rich, which is to say not a poor person themselves, regardless of how close they are in kinship or friendship to someone who is poor, may not take peah on behalf of a specific poor person. Rather, if they pick up peah from the corners of the field, they must give it to the first poor person who appears before them. We are obligated to listen to the voice of the most vulnerable. In the case of the peah portion that is given from a suspended vine or date palm tree that can't be reached, the landowner is supposed to bring down the food and divide it evenly. But if they want to go up and pick it for themselves, they may do so. The text even says that if 99 people say that the farmer should pick it for them, but even 1 out of 100 says that they want to go up and pick it for themselves, they heed the one, because that person spoke according to the law. In other words, dignity is to be upheld. We don't get to tell people how they should be helped. They should make those determinations themselves. And so even in these, sorry. But this is not the only system, this system of peah, leket, and shichacha that upholds the dignity of a person, and that the dignity of the individual seems to drive the method by which tzedakah is given. Although there are more examples than I could ever share, even in a high holiday sermon, I want to share one of my absolute favorite texts that I think illustrates this to a T. It's found in the Talmud in Masechet Brachot. It is said that Rav Hana bar Hanilai had 60 bakers in-house, day and night, baking for anyone who needed bread. He never took his hand out of his pocket, so that when a person who had become poor came to ask, that person would not feel humiliated while Rav Hana went to get money for him. The doors to this bakery were open in all 4 directions, and anyone who came in hungry would leave satisfied. Furthermore, in times when food was scarce, Rav Hana would leave wheat and barley outside the door so that anyone who was too embarrassed to come and take in the daytime could come and take unnoticed at night. Rav Hana sets up a model that, although he is the one sustaining it, is not built for him, or even according to his needs, his interests, or his interpretations. A model that is entirely shaped by the needs of those he serves. And so why do I share these examples, these texts? And what do they have to do with our story about the box on Yom Kippur afternoon in the back room off of the social hall? In every moment and epoch of Jewish civilization, in the biblical narrative, in our rabbinic texts, in medieval Jewish communities across the diaspora, and in early modern times, the Jewish community has always been built around the notion that one of the core values of community, not just of individuals within the community, but of the community, is to care for those who are in need and to protect their right to access that care and those services. So what do we do in our contemporary moment to do that? What is our system at Or Hadash to uphold this? In addition to the structures that are built into our wider system, we at Or Hadash have this kind of a system in our Rabbi's discretionary fund, a fund of money dispersed as anonymously as possible to anyone in our community who has a need. I want to say this now very plainly. If you are in need of assistance, your community at Or Hadash can help to lighten your burden. This year, every single one of us is struggling, and every one of us is responding and reacting to a country in crisis, a globe in crisis. Some of us are struggling physically because of our health. Some in our community contracted COVID-19. Some of us have lost family members and friends. Some of us are struggling financially. We have lost our jobs or our businesses, or are having trouble finding and sustaining freelance work. Some of us are struggling socially, having lost the ability to be in the company of other people because our schools are closed and we cannot see our friends and our teachers, because we are working from home, because we cannot access the communities and spaces we once could. Some of us are struggling for lack of time, having to homeschool children while simultaneously working full-time jobs. Some of us are struggling for too much time alone in the house by ourselves. Some of us are struggling because of the devastating effects of systemic racism in our society. Some of us are struggling emotionally with feelings of depression, anxiety, and dread about the condition of our country and our world. But all of us are struggling, and whatever your burden is, there is no shame in struggling and no shame in asking for help. There is no shame in putting something into that box in the back room on Yom Kippur, and there is no shame in taking something out. I am here making the opposite of a High Holidays fundraising appeal. There will be one made by Rob Klotz on Yom Kippur, but this is not it. I am here asking you to ask me for funds. If you are struggling to pay a water bill, if you are struggling to make a rent payment, if you are questioning whether you have the funds for dues for membership this year, we don't have unlimited funds in our rabbi's discretionary fund, but what we do have is for disbursement. It is not meant to sit in the bank. It is meant to be used. It is what makes us a community, as our text from Pirkei Avot, as our story, and as Rav Chana Bar Chani Lai indicates, a thriving and functioning society. In a world that feels out of control, we can work to repair it. And that process starts in our own homes, in our families, and in our Or Hadash family. We can uphold each other's dignity, and we can address each other's needs, because our community is stronger than COVID-19, than fires, than hurricanes, than political unrest. Our community can be a safety net for each other, financially, socially, and emotionally. And on this morning of Rosh Hashanah, this first morning of the new year, I want you to know that in this difficult time, Or Hadash is here. And this is what it means to create an Olam Tzedek, a more just world. Shana Tova.